Hello and welcome to another video review. This is King's Quest, Quest for the Crown, for various PC systems of the 80s and early 90s, as well as Sega Master System. This is a pure classic Sierra adventure game and pretty much put them on the map as innovators in the adventure game genre. And the simple reason for that was, it was one of the first graphical adventure games ever made. And that's a big achievement. Because before that, you had games like Zork, which were text-based, and don't get me wrong, I enjoy Zork, but it just isn't the same as playing something like King's Quest with suddenly you have graphics. Wow! It blew everybody's mind back then. And while they obviously don't look at all impressive by today's standards, the visuals for the time were just so novel, they were so interesting, you had never seen anything like it before. And on top of that, it was a game that pretty much popularized Sierra's adventure game interpreter engine, the AGI engine, that would be used in later games like, of course, King's Quest 2 and 3 and so on. So, this is a very interesting game, and it's actually one that holds a good spot in my heart because it was one of the first PC games I actually played. So, yeah, we're talking old history for me here. But suffice to say, let's go ahead and get started with the actual reviewing. Now, obviously, the presentation isn't much to talk about, especially by today's standards, because we're used to those super high-fidelity games and so on. But back in 1983 and then 1990, with this SAI version that you're seeing here, these graphics were mind-boggling. We had never seen anything like it before in an adventure game. It was just unheard of. It was all text-based. Suddenly, we get this. And the original version of the game had very flat color schemes. Nothing was particularly well detailed, but it did enough to kind of help you get immersed in the world and everything. Whereas with the SCI version, they obviously enhanced the visuals a fair amount, and you can very clearly tell what things are. Animations are fairly smooth and fluid for the most part. And it has this nice visual charm about it, even though the graphics are so old. It's kind of hard to describe. You can just look at this thing and you can just tell there's charm about it. It's colorful, it's bright, it's fairy tale-esque, and that's something that fits in with the rest of the game very well. So even though these graphics really haven't aged all that well, it still is pleasant to look at, which is kind of hard to comprehend. As far as the sound design goes, it's pretty much non-existent. It's a bunch of PC speaker stuff and sounds pretty terrible. It does have some music in there, but it's okay. It doesn't really do all that much except fit in with the fairy tale vibe. So, presentation, like I said, it hasn't aged all that well, but even then it still has a lot of charm about it. The ultimately what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is admittedly very simple. You play as Graham, the greatest knight in all of Daventry, who is summoned by the king to recover lost treasure that was stolen from the castle. And the king has no heirs, so he's decided that Graham's reward for if he accomplishes this task is that he will become the king. So, what ends up happening there is that you embark on this quest to recover this treasure, and you encounter all sorts of odd characters along the way. It's a very fairy tale-esque story in that it deals with a lot of elements from fairy tales that you've, of course, read and heard growing up. And, of course, that lends a lot of charm to the storyline, even though it is a very simple one, which is just find the treasure and return it. So, how does this factor into the gameplay? Well, you also have to keep in mind that this was one of the first graphical adventure games, so the way it did things was pretty unheard of for the time. Unlike in, say, Zork, where you would just have your text parser and you would type in a command and it would do it, like, say, go north, and your character would go north, or open mailbox, and they open the mailbox. In this, you have the text parser, and you still enter your commands, like, say, get shovel, or whatever. But you also have your character to move around on the screen using the arrow keys. And this is an interesting twist on the typical parser-based gameplay. because you have to position your character appropriately to do certain tasks. Like you have to move them in front of a tree if you want them to climb it, or you have to move them into a lake in order to get them to start swimming. Although they start flailing around madly until you tell them to swim, so that's something to keep in mind. And so, unlike normal adventure games for the time, it was a very interesting control scheme. Now, these days it's very noticeably clunky, and even back then it was kind of difficult to work with sometimes because of the way you'd have to go up and down stairs or move on very narrow areas and such like that. Sometimes being a pixel off meant the difference between getting across a certain area and just falling to your doom or something like that. So that sometimes gets annoying the way it works because there is no diagonal movement, only the cardinal directions. So admittedly, that does get kind of irritating sometimes when you're sitting there trying to make more precise movements. Luckily, the game doesn't make you do that very much, so it's not that big of an issue. Then there's the puzzle design, which can be somewhat of an issue sometimes. Most of the puzzles in this game are pretty easy to figure out. It's more the execution sometimes that gets in your way. Like, for instance, certain puzzles require you to have pretty good timing to actually get them right. Now, they do give you a decent amount of time to complete these puzzles if there's timing involved, but it takes knowing that you have to do that timing-based puzzle. And your first time through, you're not going to know that. Because some of the puzzles, while they are fairly straightforward once you know what to do, trying to figure out what to do can be very confusing, because the game doesn't tell you all that much. If you say, look at items in your inventory, it gives you descriptions of them and it shows you what they are, but you may not look at that and go immediately, I know what this is for, because it may not come up for quite some time. Whereas in other games, sometimes it becomes very noticeable right off the bat what you use something for. This one, it's much more subtle about how it tells you how to do puzzles, and sometimes it outright doesn't even tell you at all, which can be very confusing sometimes. For instance, there is one part where you actually have to go into a water area, and you have to tell your character to hold his breath, and if you don't do that, then he dies. And that's one thing that this started that Sierra Adventure Games would do from then on. Lots and lots of ways to die. Some of them kind of horrible. And the way this one does it is with such a fairy tale glee and just very light-hearted sense of doing them. You can't help but kind of smile when they happen, because they're just silly. It's not a matter of it being malicious or anything, it's just silly. And so, when you die in this game, unless you hadn't saved for a long time, which I don't know why you wouldn't, I mean, it's a classic game, you of course save all the time. But when you die in this game, it's not really annoying so much as it is amusing. At least until you run across those puzzles where you just get really frustrated because you can't do them or something like that, or you can't figure out what it is, or you know what to do, but your timing is off all the time. But that makes the completion of those puzzles all the more satisfying. And so, the game does make you use your brain. You do have to think outside the box most of the time. And it's a very nice thing to do that. The problem being, I haven't played this game for a very long time. And that can be a problem, because when you're going back to it and you're trying to remember all the commands and how the various puzzles are solved, yeah, you can kind of just fail miserably at it. But still, it's a very fun game. The problem is, I can't really recommend it to everybody, because it's got a very limited appeal. It's a parser-based adventure game, and on top of that, it's so simple, yet so witty, that you have to really think way harder about something like this than you do with other adventure games. Even other Sierra Adventure games, you don't necessarily have to think about as much as one like King's Quest I, or the other parser-based Sierra Adventure games. These games require a lot of thought, and so they have a pretty limited appeal. And the reason they require all that thought is because you do have to use your imagination a lot more to fill in the blanks of what things are and how to use them. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in that. On the one hand, this game has a lot of charm, and it's really fun for me to play. But I, again, can't recommend it to everybody. The people I can recommend it to are anyone interested in video game history, because this is a pretty big deal on this in the development of adventure games. And I can also recommend it to adventure game fans who can very easily put up with something like the parser-based system and can really have the patience for this. But it's not a game I can universally recommend like I can with something like Gabriel Knight. Ultimately, though, check it out if you're interested. Thanks for watching.